On this episode of Treasure Expeditions, I visit the historic Denver and New Orleans Railroad House. The historic building is home to the Elbert County Artists Guild Art Gallery. Photographer Jeff Struthers features his art at the gallery. Other Art Guild members feature their art too. Join me as I metal detect for artifacts on the Denver and New Orleans Railroad House property. It's where railroad employees lived in the 1800s. And I'm metal detecting on the historic property. I have a metal detecting hit here, so I'm going to explore and see what I can find. I dig deeper on the historic property. Next, I discover something else. I'm digging up this object right here that's metal, and it looks to be a crossbow arrow, or an arrow. I found an arrow. It's modern, so I think it's used as an archery crossbow, and it's an interesting object. It's just surprising. It may not be the most valuable of items, but it's incredibly surprising. I found this at the historic house in Elbert County, Colorado. Next, I discover something else. I found this metal bed frame. It looks to be an antique. There's kind of an intricate design. I think it is too mangled to be salvaged, but it's interesting, and it's on the historic property in Elizabeth, Colorado. I found it. I thought it was a metal detecting hit, and there may have been a metal detecting hit nearby, but I looked up and found the metal bed frame, and it could have been setting off the metal detector. You can find a lot of junk on your search for treasure. Found this piece of metal on the historic property in Elizabeth, Colorado, in Elbert County, Colorado. I've also located what looks like a metal sign, and hopefully an antique sign, but it may just be a piece of metal, and that's located right here. I've located that using the metal detector, and there was a metal detecting hit. I discovered a giant metal object. I think I'm stepping on something metal when I go towards the camera. Yep. It looks to be a sign of some kind. I'm uncovering it with the shovel. I hope it is a sign of some kind. I'm worried about the bugs underneath. Let's see. Don't want to hurt it. Scrape this off of here. So it looks like it was a sign at some time, but you can't read what was on it. This is the other side. I don't know, it could just be a piece of metal from something, but it kind of looks like a sign, and there are holes in it, which might indicate where they put the nails or screws to hang it up, but I'm not sure. But this is the metal I found. American Legion Post 82 Commander Ted Lipka reveals the location of the historic tracks in Elizabeth, Colorado.
So just east of Main Street is right along Running Creek, where the tracks used to exist. And then with the flood of 1935, all of that was washed out. And as a result, the decision was made when they rebuilt the rail line to the south to move it over to the existing tracks there, just on the other side of I-25 that run through Castle Rock, which was unfortunate because Elizabeth and even Elbert, farther south, were pretty dependent on that transportation node to facilitate, business and just, I wouldn't say everyday life, but it was a big part of the community up until that point.
Ted says there's a path to follow.
With regard to the railroad, is if you go on Google Maps and look at Elizabeth and look down toward, kind of zoom out so that you can include Elbert in the frame, you can still see where the elevations for the tracks are in a lot of places. Now, in some places they've been cut through or whatever, but by and large, you can trace the path down from Elizabeth down to the intersection at County Road 106 to where it turns over and heads over toward Elbert. And that's as far as I've explored, just doing a map study. But to see that and then to go and drive by it, and you're like, oh, well, that's why that hill that seems like it shouldn't be there is there, because they were using it for the railroad.
Ted talks about his title.
I'm the post commander for Post 82 for the American Legion here in Elizabeth, Colorado.
Ted shares about the features of the American Legion.
It's a gathering place. We have the great hall here behind us. We've got storage and an administrative office for facilitating things that we have to do of that nature. But then we also have our lounge, which is whenever we're gathering for social events, primarily we stay contained in there because it's usually not more than a dozen people. But if it is a bigger event, then we'll bring it out this way.
Ted reveals the motivation behind his military experience.
We have people that don't want to see America succeed. And so it's important that we have people that are ready and willing to stand and defend our nation's interests both here and overseas. And so I think that the military and military service is important because it gives people a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of ownership, in terms of if people are sacrificing for this American ideal, then I think they have a greater vested interest, and that causes it to what they have as Americans to mean more to them.
Ted shares more about his military service.
I joined the Marine Corps later in life. I was actually a week past my 29th birthday when I went to boot camp, which is fairly unusual. Most folks join fairly close to getting out of high school, but it was something that I always wanted to do. And unfortunately, in that regard, the opportunity didn't come along till much later in life. That being said, I've tremendously enjoyed my time. I've got over 24 years in the reserves now and have had some tremendous experience. I spent 5 years on the enlisted side as a radio operator, did my first deployment as an enlisted Marine in 2003. And then after we came back, I looked into taking a reserve commission, which I did as an artillery officer. And so spent my first few years as an artillery officer with cannon battery and then a rocket battery. That was actually where I spent the majority of my company level time. And then I've also served as a staff officer for an artillery battalion. I've served with the Marine Corps History Division, had the opportunity to interview Marines from guys that participated in World War II through Vietnam up through the global war on terror. And probably the most rewarding part of my military career was getting to hear other people's stories. It's one thing to experience it yourself, but you're also kind of limited to whatever roll of the dice you get and where you happen to be sent in terms of like being on a deployment. And for me, my deployments were fairly unremarkable. There wasn't a whole lot going on in the areas that I was sent. But to be able to talk to guys, particularly, I was a high school social studies teacher at one time. And so to be able to, as a historian, hear their stories and find out more about that firsthand was pretty awesome.
Ted says there are humanitarian efforts he's been involved in.
For the military, works primarily with organizations like International Red Cross or U.S. AID, United States Association for International Development, I believe is the acronym. And anytime there's a need for humanitarian assistance or disaster recovery, So, for instance, hurricanes, prime example. Going to Haiti and helping those folks, put their lives back together. That's something that a civil affairs officer could be tasked with assisting. And even though in those instances it's generally the non-governmental organizations like International Red Cross that are doing the bulk of the organization and things like that, where they rely on the military is for assistance in transportation and logistics, because those organizations typically don't maintain a lot of vehicles and airplanes and things like that that you need in order to get the supplies to the affected area and the affected population. So the military will work with them in order to facilitate that. It's their show. We really don't have a whole lot of say in it other than how it impacts our resources. But we always emphasize that we're there to help. We're not there to take over or to be a military presence. We're in uniform. It's true, and we do have some level of security just for personnel and to guard our resources. But beyond that, we're not serving in a military capacity.
Ted discusses his work in Guatemala.
For instance, I went down to Guatemala a couple of years ago as part of a joint task force with the Air Force and the Army. And we were going around to villages in Guatemala, setting up kind of like 9 News has a health fair here in Denver every year. Similar situation where we go to a school, we say, hey, we'd like to come in and bring doctors and dentists and have them provide services to the people in your village. And of course, the head of the school or the mayor is like, oh, that's great. What can we do? And so we help to get the word out ahead of time. We execute the health fair, for lack of a better term. And then we'll go back and we'll be like, hey, were we here for long enough? Did enough people, were they able to receive services? Is there something that we could do better next time? And just kind of work with them that way.
Ted says there were many uses for the American Legion building.
I mean, this building is over 100 years old. You may have noticed when you came in that we have that plaque that was given to us recently from the Historical Society recognizing the historical nature of this building. Back in the day, this was a theater. It was a roller rink. It was a basketball court. And then up until about 10 years ago, from I believe it was about the mid 1980s to the early 2000s, or it became, into the 20 teens, it was the town hall for Town of Elizabeth. And then they moved into a new building down the street and came to us and said, hey, we have this building and we'd like to work something out with the American Legion so that the building stays maintained, stays available for use to people in the public. And so we were able to work something out. That being said, with this building being here for over 100 years, you might find some really interesting artifacts, things that have been left from people that utilize the building, or because it has had various uses, there might have been things that just got dropped and then covered up.
Ted describes where the town of Elizabeth is located.
Castle Rock is probably the easiest point of reference for people, because most people are familiar with Denver and Colorado Springs on I-25, and then Castle Rock being on I-25 as well. It's easiest to just tell people we're 15 miles east of Castle Rock.
Ted says there are dangers of the job.
There is still an emotional burden placed on family members, mom and dad, siblings, because they're going to be worried about the service member, when they're away from home. And it doesn't even have to be a situation where you're going into harm's way. Unfortunately, things happen in training as well. In the last few years, we've lost aircraft due to, mechanical situations or weather, things like that. And so there's really no guarantee. And so being in the military does, sort of, I would say, require more from people in terms of just that level of risk that you're assuming and the emotional exposure that the family faces, with the member just doing their job.
Ted discusses a memorable moment from his service in the Marines.
Deployed in 2007, and I was in Iraq, and so we were there for Christmas, and the guys from my unit, we had acquired a small barbecue, and we were able to purchase steaks, and so rather than going down and eating in the chow hall, with everyone else, we kind of threw our own little Christmas party, where complete with Santa hats and uh, you know gift exchange, stocking stuffers, things like that. And that really kind of helped ease the pain of not being with family during the holidays.
Ted says the American Legion participates in helping the community for the holidays.
Probably the biggest thing for this post is the food drive that we conduct in the Elizabeth area for the benefit of veterans in our community. And so right now we have teams of people that are up at Safeway and at Walmart collecting food from customers that once they're done this afternoon, they'll bring it back here, and at some point we'll move down to Frontier High School just down the street, where there's a larger storage area, and over the next 6 weeks we'll completely overwhelm our storage and most of the storage down there. And just before the holidays, we get teams together, we box up not just meals, but it's like a whole menu for veterans in our community. And then once all of that is done, we'll go out. We get a list from the county veteran service officer, as well as some other nonprofits in the area, and make sure that we've got a list of all the veterans, so that we can make sure that veterans have a good meal for the holidays.
Ted explains the upside of living in a small community.
I'm grateful for a wonderful community. I think we're very blessed to live in an area that still very much reflects a rural lifestyle, even given the close proximity that we have to Denver and Colorado Springs. And so to me, just to be able to have the relationship with my neighbors and the community where people still wave at you when you pass them on the street. We still have homecoming parades and fall festivals down on Main Street. I think it's a real privilege to be able to have that.
Ted shares his views.
I believe that there's something greater than ourselves, and there's only so much that we can do through our own efforts. Not only in that we need other human beings, just from time to time to help us through, even if it's just for someone to talk to, not necessarily providing a physical or financial support, but just to be there and to have someone to interact with. And I think the universe is far too big for there to not be something that is responsible for all of us.
Ted describes a turkey sighting.
I love the wild turkeys. As a matter of fact, I was working downstairs in my office the other day, and something kind of came into my field of vision out the window, and I had about half a dozen or so that were wandering back through my backyard. And again, going back to the rural lifestyle, that's something you don't get living up in town.
Ted describes a memorable moment from the military.
Those things that stick out were just pulling into Pearl Harbor in 2003, because we were on ship, and it's a tradition for the personnel aboard a ship, Navy ship, when you're passing the USS Arizona, everyone is doing what they call manning the rails. So they've got all the personnel around the exterior of the ship, and as you go by, they blow the whistle and everybody salutes You hold it for about 30 seconds, and then you cut, and it's very very humbling experience, to pay tribute to those that gave their lives that day.
According to Ted, historic railroad tracks can have a unique feature.
One cool thing with regard to the railroad is if you go on Google Maps and look at Elizabeth and look down toward, kind of zoom out so that you can include Elbert in the frame, you can still see where the elevations for the tracks are in a lot of places. Now, in some places they've been cut through or whatever, but by and large, you can trace the path down from Elizabeth down to the intersection at County Road 106 to where it turns over and heads over toward Elbert. And that's as far as I've explored, just doing a map study. But to see that and then to go and drive by it, and you're like, oh, well, that's why that hill that seems like it shouldn't be there is there, because they were using it for the railroad.
I discovered some fascinating discoveries thanks to the Elbert County Artists Guild, including a possible 1900s hitching post where ranchers would tie up their horses. Ted reveals the location of the railroad.
So just east of Main Street is right along Running Creek, where the tracks used to exist. And then with the flood of 1935, all of that was washed out. And as a result, the decision was made when they rebuilt the rail line to the south to move it over to the existing tracks there, just on the other side of I-25 that run through Castle Rock, which was unfortunate because Elizabeth and even Elbert, farther south, were pretty dependent on that transportation node to facilitate, business and just, I wouldn't say everyday life, but it was a big part of the community up until that point.
Ted told us more about the history of Elizabeth, including the historic 1800s railroad track. Ted described a tight-knit rural community. He described the togetherness the holidays can bring, while describing the sacrifices military and their families make to protect America. Happy treasure hunting. Remember, the greatest treasures are the memories you make along the way. For Wire Ride TV and WireRide.com, I'm Terri Saunders.